Welcome back, Wastelanders, to another journey into the darkest corners of the Fallout universe. Today's story explores a nightmare scenario where the Brotherhood of Steel never formed, where Captain Maxson died in those first crucial hours after the bombs fell. What you're about to hear is the testimony of a soldier who lived through the technological apocalypse that followed. Without the Brotherhood to secure dangerous weapons and preserve crucial knowledge, the Wasteland became a feeding ground for warlords with nuclear arsenals and raiders with energy weapons. This is a world where the Master's unity expanded unchecked, where the Enclave emerged with no organized opposition, where humanity tore itself apart with the very tools that could have saved it. This confession will take you through 60 years of escalating horror, showing you how the absence of one organization led to the complete collapse of human civilization. And if you genuinely enjoy this kind of dark storytelling, consider subscribing and liking the channel, but only if it truly resonates with you. My name is Sergeant Marcus Cole. I was there when it all went wrong. I was there when Captain Roger Maxson died in those first terrible hours after the bombs fell. And with him died humanity's last real chance for order in the Wasteland. You need to understand something before I continue this recording. What I'm about to tell you isn't in any history you've heard, because there's nobody left to write history books anymore. Just endless war, endless slaughter, and technology turned into a curse instead of salvation. October 23rd, 2077. We were stationed at Mariposa Military Base when the sirens started. Captain Maxson had just finished executing Colonel Spindle and Dr. Anderson for their FEV experiments 3 days prior. We thought we were heroes, standing up against the government's atrocities. We thought we'd already seen the worst humanity could do to itself. We were wrong, so terribly wrong. When the bombs started falling, Maxson tried to lead us out. He had this vision, you see. Even in those first chaotic hours, he was talking about preserving technology, about creating something new from the ashes of the old world. He called it a brotherhood, a new order that would shepherd humanity through the darkness. But as we tried to evacuate the base with our families, a secondary explosion from a nearby impact sent shrapnel through the convoy. I watched Captain Maxson bleed out in the irradiated dust, his wife trying to hold his wounds closed while his young son screamed. Without his leadership, without his vision, we scattered like roaches when the light comes on. Some of us made it to Lost Hill's bunker. We thought we could carry on without him, but we were just scared soldiers without a mission. No grand purpose, no unifying philosophy. Within 6 months, the bunker descended into infighting. Different factions formed, each claiming they knew what Maxson would have wanted. By the end of the first year, we'd turned our guns on each other. I barely escaped with my life when Lieutenant Morrison's faction decided anyone who disagreed with militaristic expansion was a traitor. Without the Brotherhood of Steel to secure them, military installations across California became graveyards of unleashed horror. I've walked through the ruins for 50 years now, watching what happened when nobody was there to lock away the weapons that should have stayed buried. The National Guard depots, the research facilities, the missile silos, all of them cracked open like eggs by desperate survivors who had no idea what they were unleashing. I remember the first time I saw what unchecked FEV did when there was no Brotherhood to contain Mariposa. The place should have been sealed forever after Maxson died, but nobody coordinated that effort. By 2080, scavenger groups had broken in, looking for weapons and supplies. They found the vats. Some fell in by accident. Others were pushed by their so-called friends who wanted to see what would happen. Without any organized force to stop him, Richard Gray didn't just become the Master. He became something far worse, because there was nobody to slow his expansion. The unity spread like wildfire through California. No Brotherhood paladins in power armor to hold the line. No scribes studying the FEV to understand its weaknesses. The Master's super mutants swept through the hub in 2130 instead of 2161. They took Junktown a year later. The Boneyard fell in 2133. Every major settlement that might have survived, that might have rebuilt civilization, was either converted or slaughtered within a decade of the Master beginning his work. You have to understand what it was like watching the unity grow without opposition. In the real timeline you might have heard about, the Brotherhood helped the Vault Dweller stop the Master in 2162. But in our world, there was no Brotherhood to provide intelligence, no Vree to discover the sterility of super mutants, no power-armored soldiers to assault Mariposa. The Vault Dweller from Vault 13 tried anyway. Brave soul that they were. I found their body outside the cathedral, torn apart by Nightkin. Their vault's location was extracted from their dying mind by the Master's psychic interrogation. Vault 13 fell 2 weeks later. Every single resident was dipped or killed. The Master didn't need to wait decades to perfect his army because there was nobody systematically destroying his operations. By 2140, the Unity controlled everything from the ruins of Bakersfield to the outskirts of what used to be San Francisco. But that wasn't even the worst of it. Without the Brotherhood hoarding technology and keeping it from the wrong hands, every 2-bit warlord with enough guns could raid a military depot and come out with energy weapons. The Great Khans found a cache of plasma rifles in 2095. The Vipers discovered pulse grenades. Even the Jackals stumbled upon a half-functioning tactical nuclear device. Can you imagine raiders with that kind of firepower and absolutely no one organized enough to stop them? I watched the Khans use those plasma rifles to carve out an empire in the ruins of Vegas. Not the Vegas you might know from other stories, where Mr. House saved the city. No, House's robots were overwhelmed when the Khans showed up with military-grade weapons and no Brotherhood to have previously cleared out the nearby arsenals. They melted through his Securitrons like butter, dragged House's life support chamber into the desert, and left him to die under the sun while they carved up his city. The thing about technology is that it's only as good or evil as the people who use it. Captain Maxson understood that. He wanted to create an organization that would preserve it, study it, and most importantly, keep it from people who would abuse it. Without him, without the Brotherhood, every piece of pre-war tech became a weapon in the hands of madmen and psychopaths. Met a trader once who told me about finding an intact robotics disposal yard in 2144. Brotherhood would have secured it, catalogued it, made sure the robots were properly contained or destroyed. Instead, some raider gang calling themselves the Circuit Breakers hacked into the mainframe with a pre-war manual they couldn't even properly read. They activated 300 military combat robots with corrupted programming. Those machines killed everything in a 50-mile radius before their power cells finally died. Men, women, children, Brahmin, even the raiders who activated them. The machines didn't discriminate. The Brotherhood's absence created a power vacuum that was filled by the worst possible alternatives. In 2145, I encountered my first example of what happens when military technology spreads without control. A group of former Vault dwellers from Vault 15 had found an abandoned military convoy. Inside were crates of experimental pre-war weapons, including something called the Molecular Disruption Field Generator. They didn't know what it was. They just knew it looked valuable. They sold it to a merchant who sold it to a warlord named Rex Hammer, who fashioned himself the Emperor of the Wastes. Rex didn't understand the science either, but he had a former Enclave deserter in his ranks who knew enough to make it operational. The first time Rex used it was against a settlement that refused to pay tribute. I was passing through the area 2 days later. Where the settlement had been, there was just glass. Smooth green glass for a quarter mile in every direction. The molecular disruption had literally disintegrated everything organic and fused the sand into that horrible smooth surface. You could still see the shadows of people burned into it like those old photographs from when the bombs first dropped. Rex used that weapon 6 more times before it overloaded and took him and half his army with it. But by then the damage was done. Other warlords had seen what pre-war tech could do, and the race was on to find the biggest, most destructive weapons possible. Without the Brotherhood to secure these sites first, it became a free-for-all that made the Great War look like a border skirmish. The year 2150 marked what survivors started calling the Age of Iron Madness. Every month brought new horrors as another cache of weapons was discovered and immediately used. I saw a group of tribals accidentally activate a pre-war weather control station. They were just looking for scrap metal, but instead triggered an atmospheric manipulation sequence that created radioactive tornadoes. Those storms raged for 3 months, tearing across the wasteland and spreading fallout into areas that had finally started to recover from the original bombs. Without the Brotherhood's knowledge and expertise, nobody knew how to shut it down. The NCR, or what was trying to become the NCR, sent their best and brightest to the station. None of them came back. The storms only stopped when the station's reactor finally melted down, creating a new glowing sea right in the middle of what should have been prime farming land. That same year, I witnessed firsthand what happened when power armor technology spread unchecked. The Brotherhood would have controlled its distribution, maintained strict protocols about who could use it and how. Instead, a raider boss named Sarah the Scorcher found a military depot with 24 pristine T-51B suits. She didn't have the training manuals the Brotherhood would have preserved, didn't understand the hydraulic pressure systems or the fusion core management. Her raiders just climbed in and started using them like medieval plate mail. The first one to die was crushed by his own suit when he damaged the hydraulic controls in combat. The armor literally folded in on itself with him inside. I can still hear the screaming, then the wet crunch when the chest piece compressed. Another raider tried to hotwire a damaged suit and created a feedback loop that cooked him alive inside the armor. The smell of roasted meat lingered for days, but the ones who figured out the basics became nearly unstoppable. Sarah's power-armored raiders swept through 3 settlements in a week. No militia could stop them. No wall could hold them. They were like titans among men until they ran into the Scorpion Gang, who had found their own cache of anti-tank weapons. The battle between those two groups leveled what was left of Barstow and irradiated the groundwater for miles around. The Master watched all of this chaos and simply absorbed it into his growing unity. Without the Brotherhood to oppose him, he had time to perfect his methods. By 2155, he had developed new strains of FEV. Not just the super mutants you might have heard about, but worse things. Creatures that could think and plan, but were completely enslaved to his will. He started capturing the warlords with their stolen technology and converting them, adding their knowledge and resources to the Unity. I remember hiding in the ruins of an old library when a Unity patrol passed by. They weren't like the super mutants from other timelines who might show some independence or personality. These were perfectly synchronized, moving in formations that no human military ever achieved. They had absorbed so many brilliant minds without opposition that they had become tactically perfect. They used pre-war military strategies combined with post-war adaptability. They were unstoppable. By 2160, the Unity controlled most of the American Southwest. But then, something else emerged from the east. Something that made even the Master's army pause. Without the Brotherhood to later oppose them in the Capital Wasteland, the Enclave had spent those decades building strength completely unmolested. They emerged from Raven Rock with technology that made everything the Wasteland warlords had found look like toys. The first Enclave battalion I saw was in 2161. Full power armor, vertibirds, energy weapons that could vaporize a super mutant in one shot. They called themselves the legitimate government of America and demanded immediate surrender from everyone they encountered. When settlements refused, they deployed chemical weapons that made FEV look merciful. I watched them gas the town of Shady Sands with something that turned every living thing into a puddle of organic soup within minutes. Plants, animals, humans, all reduced to the same grey sludge that they then burned with flamers to prevent contamination. The Enclave's expansion west and the Unity's expansion east inevitably collided. When they met in 2162, it was like watching 2 tsunamis crash together. The Master's psychic abilities against the Enclave's advanced technology. Super mutants with stolen heavy weapons against Enclave soldiers with powered armor that made T-51B look like tin cans. The battleground stretched across Nevada and Utah, turning entire regions into burnt wasteland where nothing would grow for decades. I tried to stay clear of the major battles, but you couldn't escape the aftermath. Refugees flooded every corner of the wasteland that wasn't already controlled by one faction or another. Entire communities picked up and fled, only to run into other groups doing the same thing. Violence broke out over water, food, and safe ground. Without any stabilizing force like the Brotherhood would have been, it was pure chaos. The smaller warlords took advantage of the chaos. While the Unity and Enclave were focused on each other, every raider gang and petty dictator made grabs for territory and technology. I saw a group of tribals break into a medical research facility and accidentally release a pre-war biological weapon that had been contained since the bombs fell. The Blue Death, they called it, because of how it turned your skin before you died. It swept through refugee camps and killed thousands before finally burning itself out. There was this moment in late 2162 when I thought maybe the two titans would destroy each other and give humanity a chance to rebuild. The Master had launched a massive assault on the Enclave's forward base, while the Enclave responded with a tactical nuclear strike on the cathedral, but both survived. The Master had spread his consciousness across multiple locations, and the Enclave had bunkers that could withstand direct hits. They just kept fighting, kept escalating, kept destroying everything in between them. The technology they threw at each other was beyond comprehension. The Enclave deployed something called Forced Evolutionary Virus Curling 13, an aerosol weapon designed to kill anyone with any genetic mutation. which by then was almost everyone in the wasteland. The Master responded by releasing creatures I don't have names for, things that violated every law of nature and science. Multi-headed monstrosities that could spit acid that melted power armor, floating beings of pure psychic energy that could drive Enclave soldiers insane inside their helmets. Merchant I traveled with for a few months told me about finding a pre-war library that had somehow survived intact. Inside, he found books about something called the Brotherhood of Steel, described as a future military order dedicated to preserving technology and knowledge. He laughed at the idea. "Can you imagine," he said, "anyone being organized enough to do that in this hellscape?" I didn't have the heart to tell him that we were living in the world where that organization never formed. By 2165, the war between the Unity and the Enclave had created what survivors called the dead zones. Entire states where the combination of biological weapons, radiation, and worse things made human life impossible. I tried to cross through what used to be Arizona once. The ground itself was hostile. Plants that moved and attacked. Air that burned your lungs even through a gas mask. Water that glowed purple and dissolved anything organic it touched. I turned back after 2 days and considered myself lucky to escape with my life. The few independent settlements that remained were forced to make impossible choices. Submit to the Unity and be transformed into super mutants. Submit to the Enclave and be eliminated as genetic impurities. Or try to stay hidden and pray that neither side found you before they destroyed each other. Most chose wrong. The graveyards of failed settlements stretched from coast to coast, each one a monument to the absence of any stabilizing force in the wasteland. I met a group of Vault dwellers from Vault 8 in 2166. In another timeline, they might have founded Vault City with the help of Brotherhood-traded medical technology. In our world, they emerged to find super mutants and Enclave forces fighting literally above their doorstep. Half were killed in the first hour. The rest scattered. Their Geekik was captured by raiders who tried to use it as a weapon and ended up creating a localized ecological disaster that transformed 50 square miles into hostile jungle that ate anyone who entered. The absence of the Brotherhood created cascading failures throughout the wasteland. Technologies that should have been preserved and studied were instead weaponized and destroyed. Knowledge that could have rebuilt civilization was lost in the endless warfare. The Brotherhood would have been educators, preservers, a shield against the worst impulses of desperate humanity. Without them, we got only the worst. What really haunts me is how preventable it all was. If Captain Maxson had lived just a few more years, if he had established the Brotherhood's foundations, everything would have been different. The Unity would have faced organized opposition from the beginning. The Enclave would have encountered a force that understood their technology and could counter it. The raiders and warlords would have found empty bunkers instead of weapons caches. Civilization might have had a chance. Instead, I watched the world tear itself apart with the very tools that could have saved it. By 2167, the war between the Unity and the Enclave had evolved into something beyond conventional conflict. Both sides had started deploying weapons that shouldn't exist. Things pulled from the deepest black site vaults and experimental programs that even the pre-war government had deemed too dangerous to use. The Master had discovered something in the ruins of West Tech that changed everything. Without the Brotherhood to have previously secured and studied the facility, he had unrestricted access to all their research. Not just FEV, but something called Project Chrysalis. I only learned the name from a dying Enclave scientist who babbled about it in his final moments. The Master had found a way to create psychic amplifiers using modified FEV combined with pre-war neural interface technology. He could now control his armies from hundreds of miles away, seeing through their eyes, feeling through their bodies. I witnessed one of these new Unity assaults firsthand in the ruins of Salt Lake City. The super mutants moved like a single organism, perfectly coordinated down to the millisecond. When one fell, the others adjusted instantly. No confusion, no hesitation. They swept through Enclave positions like water through a broken dam. The Enclave's superior firepower meant nothing when every shot that missed was instantly communicated to every Unity soldier, who adjusted their approach accordingly. The Enclave's response was to dig deeper into their own pre-war archives. They pulled out something called Project Archimedes, not the version you might have heard about with orbital lasers, but something worse. They had found a way to weaponize the Van Allen radiation belts themselves. They could call down focused beams of cosmic radiation that would cook anything organic from the inside out. while leaving structures intact. The first test was on a Unity stronghold in Colorado. When I passed through the area months later, the building stood perfect and untouched, filled with the crystallized remains of super mutants who had been turned into statues of irradiated carbon. Without the Brotherhood to serve as a moderating force, to provide an alternative to these two extremes, regular humans were caught in an ever-tightening vice. Communities that had survived since the bombs fell were forced to choose sides or be destroyed. I stayed with a group in the Mojave who tried to remain neutral. They lasted exactly 13 days before an Enclave patrol found them. The officer didn't even ask questions. He just looked at the radiation scanner, saw that everyone had trace mutations from decades of wasteland exposure, and ordered the settlement burned. The technology kept escalating because there was nobody to say, enough, nobody to secure and study these weapons instead of immediately deploying them. In 2168, a raider gang stumbled into a cache of pre-war autonomous combat drones while both major powers were distracted. These weren't the iBots or Mr. Handys you might know. These were military-grade hunter-killers with adaptive AI that learned from every engagement. The raiders activated them thinking they'd found an army. Instead, the drones identified all humans as hostiles and began systematic extermination. For 3 months, those drones carved a path of death across the wasteland. They would hit a settlement, kill everything that moved, then analyze the tactics used to try to stop them and adapt. By the end, they were practically invincible to small arms fire and had learned to anticipate human behavior patterns. It took a combined Unity and Enclave force to finally stop them. One of the few times the two powers worked together, and even then, we lost thousands. The drone incident taught both sides a terrible lesson that without the Brotherhood's philosophy of careful study and controlled distribution, technology was just another weapon to be grabbed and used. The Unity began creating cyber-modified super mutants, abominations with pre-war military computers grafted into their brains. The Enclave responded with something they called Genesis soldiers, humans so heavily modified with cybernetics and genetic manipulation that calling them human was generous at best. I encountered one of these Genesis soldiers in 2169. It had been separated from its unit and was slowly dying from rejection syndrome, its body fighting against its own modifications. It couldn't remove its helmet because the helmet was part of its skull. It begged me to kill it, said it could feel every nerve ending that had been replaced with circuitry, burning constantly. I put a bullet through its brainstem, the only part still human enough to die properly. In its final moments, it whispered a name, someone it remembered from before the modifications. That person had been dead for 50 years. The psychological warfare was almost worse than the physical destruction. The Master had learned to broadcast psychic signals that could drive unprotected humans insane. Entire settlements would tear each other apart in induced rage or curl up and die from artificially implanted despair. The Enclave countered with wide area deployment of psychoactive chemicals that removed the ability to feel fear or pain, but also most higher reasoning. I saw Enclave-dosed civilians charge super mutant positions with their bare hands, laughing as they were torn apart. There's a special kind of horror in watching humanity's greatest achievements turned into instruments of annihilation. Pre-war America had created wonders, technologies that could have rebuilt the world. Instead, without anyone to preserve and protect them, they became nothing more than bigger clubs for cavemen to beat each other with. The Brotherhood would have been custodians of this knowledge, keeping it safe until humanity was ready. Without them, we proved we were never ready. In 2170, I met a woman named Sarah, who claimed to be from a vault where the experiment was to preserve pre-war scientific knowledge. Vault 18, she called it. The overseer had decided to open the vault and share their knowledge to help rebuild. They had medical technology, agricultural science, water purification systems, everything a recovering world needed. The first group they encountered was Unity Scouts. The super mutants didn't want their knowledge. They wanted their bodies for conversion. The few who escaped, including Sarah, then ran into an Enclave patrol. The Enclave didn't want their knowledge either. They wanted them dead for genetic impurity. Sarah survived by hiding in a radstorm that killed her companions, but that her vault suit protected against. She had a data pad with her containing the sum of her vault's knowledge. She gave it to me before dying from radiation poisoning 3 days later. I tried to find someone, anyone who could use the information. Every scientist I found was already enslaved to one faction or another. Every independent settlement was too focused on immediate survival to think about long-term rebuilding. That datapad represented centuries of accumulated knowledge, and it died with a raider's bullet when he shot me for my water and didn't even bother checking what else I carried. The concept of controlled technology, of careful study and gradual reintroduction, was completely alien to this world. When someone found a new weapon, they used it immediately, consequences be damned. I watched a settlement discover a cache of mini-nukes and immediately fire them all at a nearby raider camp. The explosion destabilized an underground fault line and created an earthquake that leveled both the settlement and 3 others nearby. The raiders they were targeting had moved on 2 days earlier. By 2171, the wasteland had become stratified into zones of control and zones of chaos. The Unity controlled the west, the Enclave held the east, and in between was a no-man's land of competing warlords, desperate refugees, and increasingly hostile mutations. The FEV had spread far beyond its original sources, carried by wind and water and the bodies of the dead. Creatures emerged that defied classification, things that seemed to exist just to cause suffering. I encountered something the locals called a shriek in the ruins of Denver. It might have been human once, or maybe several humans fused together by radiation and FEV. It had multiple mouths that all screamed in different pitches, creating a sound that could shatter glass and burst eardrums. But worse was what the sound did to your mind. It induced hallucinations, made you see dead loved ones, hear voices of people you'd failed to save. 3 of my traveling companions killed themselves after exposure to that thing. I only survived by stuffing my ears with cloth and Radaway gel, and even then, I heard those screams in my dreams for years. The Master's evolution hadn't stopped at psychic powers. By 2172, he had learned to create what he called Unity nodes, biological transmitters made from modified human brains that could extend his consciousness across the continent. Each node was a person, or what had been a person, kept alive in a tank of FEV-enriched fluid, their brain rewired to serve as a relay station. The process was irreversible, and the victims remained conscious, trapped in their own minds, while the Master used their neural pathways as communication highways. I found one of these nodes by accident in an abandoned hospital. The screaming led me to it, though the sound came from speakers, not the node itself. Its vocal cords had been removed, but someone had rigged a pre-war voice synthesizer to its pain centers. Every nerve firing was translated into sound. When I found the courage to look closer, I saw the eyes tracking my movement. Still aware, still present, still suffering. I destroyed the node with thermite, the only mercy I could offer. The Master lost communication with 12 battalions that day, but I like to think I saved 1 soul. The Enclave's counter-evolution was no less monstrous. They had developed something called Protocol 7, a systematic program to create the perfect post-human soldier. They would take children, the younger the better, and begin modifications that would continue for years. Skeletal reinforcement, organ redundancy, neural acceleration, sensory enhancement. By the time they reached adulthood, if you could call it that, they were living weapons programmed with absolute loyalty to the Enclave's cause. I met one who had escaped, or been allowed to escape, as some kind of test. She looked maybe 16 but told me she was 27. Her bones had been replaced with a titanium composite that made her nearly unbreakable, but caused constant pain as her muscles had to work harder to move the heavier skeleton. Her eyes had been replaced with advanced sensors that could see in perfect darkness, but gave her migraines in normal light. She couldn't eat normal food because her digestive system had been modified to process a specific nutrient paste the Enclave produced. She was slowly starving to death in a world full of food she couldn't digest. She told me about the training, about being forced to kill other Protocol 7 subjects who showed weakness or defiance, about the neural conditioning that made disobedience physically painful, about the drugs they pumped into them to suppress emotional responses. She had broken free when a Unity psychic attack had disrupted her neural implants, giving her just enough autonomy to run. But freedom, she said, was just a different kind of prison, when you've been turned into something that can't exist without your captor's infrastructure. The war created its own ecosystem of horror. Scavengers who followed battles to strip the dead found that both sides had begun booby-trapping corpses with biological weapons. Touch the wrong body, and you'd be infected with a designer plague that would spread to your entire group before showing symptoms. The Unity's dead would sometimes reanimate, not as ghouls, but as something worse, driven by residual psychic commands to continue fighting. The Enclave's Genesis soldiers had fail-safe devices that would detonate if their vital signs ceased, turning their corpses into chemical bombs. I learned to recognize the signs of recent battles. The color of the sky would change from the chemicals released. The ground would be glass or turn to something with the consistency of tar. You'd find shadows burned into walls. But unlike atomic shadows, these would move when you weren't looking directly at them. Some kind of psychic residue from the Unity's weapons. Birds avoided these areas completely. Even radroaches, who would eat anything and survive anywhere, stayed clear. The chemical weapons were perhaps the worst aspect of this war without rules, without any organization trying to preserve some semblance of humanity. The Enclave had developed targeted biological agents that could distinguish between genetic markers. They would deploy these in areas suspected of harboring Unity sympathizers. The weapons would ignore pure-strain humans but would cause anyone with any level of mutation to literally melt from the inside out. I saw entire towns die in minutes, their only crime being 2 generations of wasteland exposure. The Unity's response was to create what they called empathy bombs, psychic weapons that would force everyone in the blast radius to feel the combined suffering of every person who had ever died in that location. In places where battles had been fought, where settlements had been massacred, the psychic weight was unbearable. Strong-minded individuals might survive, but be permanently broken. Weaker ones would simply cease, their minds shutting down rather than process that level of pain. By 2173, non-aligned humans had become an endangered species. We existed in the margins, in the places too worthless for either side to claim. We developed our own culture of survival, never staying in one place too long, never gathering in groups large enough to be noticed. We had a saying, the day is Unity's, the night is Enclave's, and the shadows belong to the dead. It meant that Unity patrols dominated during daylight. Enclave operations happened under cover of darkness, and if you wanted to live, you existed in the spaces between, with the ghosts and the memories. I joined up with a caravan running supplies to the few independent settlements that remained. We called ourselves the Neutrals, though that was more aspiration than fact. You couldn't be truly neutral in a war that had consumed everything. We just tried to help who we could while avoiding drawing attention from either side. We had rules. Never carry technology advanced enough to be worth taking. Never travel in groups larger than 10. Never stay in one place longer than 3 days. Never ask anyone about their past. The caravan's leader was a ghoul named Marcus, who had been around since before the war. He remembered when the bombs fell, remembered the years immediately after when people still thought rebuilding was possible. He told me once that the saddest part wasn't the death or the destruction. It was watching humanity have every tool it needed to recover and choosing to use those tools to destroy each other instead. The Brotherhood, he said, reading from some old military documents he'd found, was supposed to prevent exactly this scenario. We were making a supply run to a settlement called Hope Springs in late 2173 when we encountered something that changed my perspective on the entire war. It was a crashed vertibird, Enclave markings, but old, from their first expansion out of Raven Rock. Inside we found records, detailed documentation of the Enclave's original plans before the war with the Unity began. They hadn't intended to fight anyone. Their original plan was to rebuild America through careful introduction of preserved pre-war technology and government structure. The records showed they had extensive files on something called the Brotherhood of Steel, a predicted post-war organization that their simulations showed would be their primary ideological opponent. They had planned for decades of careful maneuvering against this Brotherhood, strategies for conversion or elimination of Brotherhood chapters, ways to acquire Brotherhood-held technology. Except the Brotherhood never formed, and without that expected opposition, the Enclave had accelerated their timeline, emerging too early, too aggressive, triggering the war with the Unity that might have been avoided if they'd had a stabilizing opponent to plan against. It's ironic, isn't it? The Enclave had prepared for an enemy that never existed, and in doing so, created a worse conflict than they ever anticipated. Without the Brotherhood to serve as a counterbalance, they had no framework for measured response, no reason to develop diplomatic solutions, no need to consider anything but total domination. They became the monster they had prepared to fight. The Unity had undergone a similar evolution. The Master's original plan, according to captured documents and the ravings of converted humans, had included provisions for dealing with Brotherhood interference. He had expected organized resistance from power-armored soldiers. expected to lose certain battles, expected to need to adapt and negotiate. Without that resistance, he had grown beyond his original constraints, becoming something that even his original personality, Richard Gray, would have found abhorrent. I need to tell you about what I found in the ruins of what should have been the NCR capital. In the timeline that never was, Shady Sands would have become the heart of a new nation, helped along by Brotherhood trade and protection agreements. In our world, it was a graveyard of melted glass and twisted metal, destroyed in the crossfire between Unity and Enclave forces in 2174. But underneath the ruins, in a vault that had been built by the town's founders, I found records that changed everything I understood about our lost future. The vault contained correspondence between settlement leaders across California from 2100 to 2140. They had been trying to organize, trying to create something like the NCR on their own. Letter after letter discussed trade agreements, mutual defense pacts, agricultural exchanges. They were so close to succeeding, but every attempt at unification failed when raiders with military weapons would attack gathering sites, or when the growing Unity would absorb key settlements. One letter, dated just weeks before Shady Sands fell to the Master, pleaded for someone, anyone, with military knowledge to help organize a defense. The writer mentioned hearing old military broadcasts about a Brotherhood of Steel, but couldn't find any trace of such an organization. The worst part was finding the children's school in that vault. They had been teaching kids about democracy, about laws, about rebuilding civilization. The last lesson on the blackboard, still readable after all these years, was about civic responsibility. Those children were probably among the first taken by the Unity, their developing minds perfect for the Master's psychic conversion process. What do you think really happened to those children after the Unity took them? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd like to know if I'm the only one who feels this way. By 2175, the technology unleashed in the war had begun to affect the very fabric of reality in some places. The concentrated use of experimental weapons, the interaction between FEV variants and radiation, the psychic energies released by the Unity, all of it combined to create zones where physics itself seemed broken. I entered one such zone near what used to be Hill Air Force Base in Utah. Inside, time moved differently. I watched a raider age to dust in seconds while standing next to a flower that remained frozen mid-bloom for the entire 3 days I was trapped there. These reality breaks were spreading. Without the Brotherhood's scientific knowledge to understand and contain them, they grew like cancers across the wasteland. Some zones would duplicate anything that entered them, creating perfect copies with all the original's memories, but with something fundamentally wrong about them. I met my own duplicate once. It had all my memories, all my scars, but its eyes were wrong, showing depths that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. We stared at each other for a long moment before it walked backward into a reality tear and disappeared. The Enclave tried to study these anomalies, setting up research stations around the more stable ones, but their approach was purely militaristic, looking for ways to weaponize them rather than understand or contain them. I watched them try to direct a temporal anomaly at a Unity stronghold. Instead of erasing the super mutants from time as intended, it created infinite versions of them, each slightly different, all fighting each other and everyone else. That battle is still going on, as far as I know. Every day, new versions of the same super mutants emerge from the anomaly. Confused and violent, the Unity's response to the anomalies was to try to absorb them, to make them part of the Master's expanding consciousness. This had catastrophic results. I witnessed the aftermath of one such attempt where an entire Unity battalion had been psychically linked when they entered a reality break. The break had scrambled their consciousness across multiple dimensions. The survivors, if you could call them that, existed in several realities simultaneously, screaming from mouths that weren't always there, reaching with hands that phased in and out of existence. In 2176, I encountered something that made me understand just how far we had fallen from any hope of recovery. It was a group of children, born after the war, who had never known anything but this chaos. They had developed their own survival strategies that were horrifying in their pragmatism. They would deliberately infect themselves with minor FEV strains to gain enough mutation to be ignored by Unity forces while maintaining enough human appearance to avoid Enclave extermination. They practiced scarification that mimicked radiation burns to appear less valuable as test subjects. These children had no concept of the world that was lost. When I tried to tell them about trees that didn't try to eat you, about water that didn't glow, about a time when humans helped each other without expecting betrayal, they laughed. Not cruel laughter, but genuine amusement at what they saw as impossible fantasies. One girl, maybe 12 years old, explained to me very seriously that kindness was a luxury only the dead could afford. She had burns across half her face from an Enclave chemical attack, and fingers fused together from a Unity conversion attempt that had been interrupted. She was the group's leader because she had survived the longest, all of 15 years. The knowledge that should have been preserved was being lost daily. I met an old woman who claimed her grandmother had been a nuclear engineer before the war. She had tried to pass down the knowledge orally, but each generation understood less, until all that remained were cargo cult rituals around maintaining reactors that no longer functioned. They would perform elaborate ceremonies, precise movements that had once been safety protocols, but without understanding why. When raiders attacked their settlement, she died trying to protect books she couldn't read, believing they contained power she couldn't access. Without the Brotherhood's archival efforts, languages themselves began to fragment and die. Technical terminology became mysticism. Scientific principles became religious doctrine. I stayed with a tribe that worshipped something they called the Holy Electromagnetic Spectrum, which was their corrupted understanding of pre-war radio technology. They believed that proper prayers broadcasted on certain frequencies would bring salvation. They had a functional ham radio but used it only for religious ceremonies, never realizing it could be used for communication. The biological weapons deployed by both sides had created new forms of suffering that shouldn't exist. The Enclave released something they designated Compound J99X in early 2177. It was designed to target the specific genetic markers the Unity used to identify potential conversion candidates. Instead, it created a plague that caused conscious necrosis. Victims remained fully aware as their bodies rotted from the inside out, a process that took weeks. The Unity's counterplague caused bone to continue growing long after the rest of the body died, creating forests of calcium spikes erupting from mass graves. I need to tell you about Paradise Valley because it represents everything we lost when the Brotherhood never formed. It was a settlement founded in 2145 by Vault Dwellers, Wastelanders, and even some peaceful super mutants who had broken free from the Unity. For 30 years, they had remained hidden, developing their own sustainable community. They had recovered pre-war agricultural techniques, built water purifiers, even established a school and medical facility. They were proof that cooperation was possible, that the cycle of violence could be broken. The settlement's leaders had actually tried to establish something like the Brotherhood themselves. They called it the Order of Preservation, dedicated to recovering and protecting beneficial technology while keeping weapons secured. They had a small library of technical manuals, a workshop for maintaining equipment, even a primitive code of ethics about technology use. For 3 decades, they had slowly expanded their influence, helping nearby settlements, sharing knowledge freely. I arrived at Paradise Valley in summer of 2177, just 2 days after it had been discovered by both the Unity and the Enclave simultaneously. The two forces had begun fighting in the valley, using the settlement as a battlefield. The residents tried to evacuate, but there was nowhere to go. The Unity wanted to convert them for their knowledge. The Enclave wanted to execute them for harboring mutants. In the crossfire, everyone died. The library burned. The water purifiers were destroyed. The last member of their Order of Preservation died trying to save a single book from the flames, a manual on sustainable farming. I pulled him from the fire, but it was too late. With his dying breath, he told me they had been so close to establishing contact with other preservation-minded groups, so close to creating a network that could have been what the Brotherhood should have been. He died believing they had failed because they weren't strong enough. He never understood that they had failed because they were alone, because the organization that should have existed to support them had never been born. The escalation of weapons technology had reached points that pre-war scientists had only theorized about. The Unity deployed something called a consciousness bomb in 2178, a psychic weapon that didn't kill, but instead merged the minds of everyone in its radius into a collective hallucination. Entire cities became trapped in shared nightmares, their bodies catatonic, while their minds lived out infinite variations of suffering. The Enclave's response was the deployment of antimatter weapons, devices that deleted matter from existence entirely. Where these weapons struck, nothing remained, not even atoms, just voids in reality that slowly collapsed in on themselves. I saw one of these antimatter strikes hit a Unity convoy. There was no explosion, no sound, just suddenly nothing where hundreds of super mutants had been. But the void left behind was wrong. Light bent around it. Time moved strangely near it. Things that got too close were pulled in and ceased to exist. Animals knew to avoid these voids instinctively, but humans, desperate for resources, would sometimes try to establish settlements near them, not understanding the danger until people started vanishing. The wildlife had adapted to the technological hellscape in ways that would have been fascinating if they weren't so terrifying. Radstags had developed the ability to sense electromagnetic fields, fleeing areas before energy weapons fire. Brahmin near Unity territories showed signs of rudimentary psychic shielding, their two heads allowing them to maintain sanity against mental attacks. Mole rats had learned to dig networks specifically to avoid detection by Enclave sensors. Even bloatflies had evolved, some variants carrying modified FEV that they spread with every sting. By late 2178, I had started keeping account of the different ways I'd seen humans die. Vaporization, dissolution, temporal displacement, psychic overload, genetic unraveling, molecular disruption, conscious petrification, recursive duplication, dimensional shearing, the list went on. Each death was someone's parent, child, lover, friend. Each represented knowledge lost, stories untold, potential unrealized. The Brotherhood would have stood against this wholesale slaughter of human potential. Instead, we got efficiency in extinction. The few remaining independent settlements had developed increasingly desperate survival strategies. Some turned to worship of the competing powers, forming cults around the Unity or the Enclave, hoping that devotion would spare them. It never did. Others dug deep, creating underground communities that tried to wait out the war. Most were buried alive when surface battles destabilized their tunnels. A few tried to preserve knowledge and culture, hiding books and art in caches they hoped future generations would find. If you've ever wondered what choice you would make in a situation like this, tell me in the comments. I'll be reading them. I met a man in 2179 who claimed to be collecting stories, trying to preserve the oral history of the wasteland before everyone who remembered the early days died. He had hundreds of accounts recorded on holotapes, stories of the first days after the bombs, of settlements that tried and failed to organize, of technologies discovered and lost. He believed that someday, someone would need these stories to understand what went wrong. I helped him bury the collection in a lead-lined vault in the mountains. As far as I know, it's still there, waiting for a future that might never come. The war had created its own economy of horror. Slavers sold humans to both sides, not caring if their cargo would be converted or executed. Organ harvesters followed battles, taking what they could from the dead and dying to sell to anyone trying to maintain their humanity through replacement parts. Information brokers traded in rumors of weapon caches or safe zones, most of which were traps or long destroyed. Even hope itself became a commodity, with con artists selling fake maps to non-existent sanctuaries. The psychological toll was perhaps worse than the physical destruction. I watched communities that had survived over a century of post-war hardship simply give up. Entire settlements would perform mass suicides rather than wait for either army to find them. Parents would mercy kill their children rather than risk them being taken for conversion or experimentation. The phrase "better dead than fled" became common, meaning it was better to die fighting than become a refugee in the no-man's lands. In early 2180, I witnessed something that still haunts my dreams. The Unity and Enclave had developed weapons specifically designed to counter each other's advantages. The Unity created what they called null zones, areas where technology simply stopped functioning. Power armor became dead weight, energy weapons wouldn't fire, even basic electronics failed. The Enclave soldiers trapped in these zones, dependent on their advanced equipment, died gasping in suits they couldn't open, cooked by reactors they couldn't shut down. The Enclave's counter was worse. They developed a biological agent that severed psychic connections. When deployed against Unity forces, it didn't just cut them off from the master, it left them aware of what they had become. Super mutants suddenly confronted with the memories of their human lives, with the full knowledge of what had been done to them and what they had done to others. The suicide rate among affected Unity forces was absolute. Not one chose to live with that knowledge. These weapons didn't just destroy their targets, they destroyed any possibility of peace. Each escalation made negotiation less possible, compromise more unthinkable. The Brotherhood would have served as a neutral party, a mediator with the strength to enforce ceasefires. Without them, there was no one both sides respected enough to broker peace. No organization with the moral authority to say, enough. The war could only end when one or both sides were completely destroyed. The environmental damage was approaching irreversibility. The water table across the continent was contaminated with FEV variants, chemical weapons, and radiation. Plants that grew in contested areas were toxic to all life. The very air in some regions had become hostile, carrying spores and viruses designed to seek out and destroy specific genetic markers. Weather patterns had been disrupted by the constant use of energy weapons and atomic detonations. Acid rain was the norm. Clean water was a myth. The sky hadn't been blue in living memory. I found myself wondering if this was always inevitable, if humanity was always doomed to destroy itself with its own creations. But then I would remember Captain Maxson's last words, reported by the few soldiers who escaped that first day. He had spoken about responsibility, about the duty of the strong to protect the weak, about knowledge as a sacred trust. Even dying, he had tried to establish principles that could have saved us all. If only he had lived another day, another hour, even another few minutes to formally establish his brotherhood. By 2181, I had stopped thinking of myself as human. Not because I had been modified or mutated, but because humanity itself had become meaningless. What does it mean to be human when every aspect of human nature has been weaponized? When compassion is a weakness that gets you killed? When the only successful survival strategy is to become as monstrous as the world around you? The Brotherhood would have preserved not just technology, but the idea that humanity was worth saving. Without them, we had forgotten why we should survive at all. The final phase of the war between the Unity and the Enclave began when both sides simultaneously discovered something in the ruins of NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain Complex. Neither would ever reveal what they found, but the effect was immediate and catastrophic. Both powers redirected their entire focus to controlling that single location. The battles that followed made everything before look like border skirmishes. I was 200 miles away when the first assault began, and I could still feel the ground shaking. The Unity sent wave after wave of super mutants, each one carrying tactical nuclear devices they would detonate if killed. The Enclave responded with orbital strikes, calling down tungsten rods from pre-war satellites that impacted with the force of atomic bombs, but without the radiation. For 3 days, the mountain was transformed into hell itself. The weapons deployed in that battle defied description. The Unity unleashed something they called the Void Caller, which opened temporary portals to somewhere else. Things came through those portals that weren't from our reality. Geometric shapes that hurt to perceive. Sounds that existed as physical objects. Creatures of pure entropy that dissolved anything they touched into probability clouds. The Enclave's response was to activate a pre-war defense system that turned the entire mountain into a massive electromagnetic pulse generator, frying anything electronic within 500 miles, including their own forces. When the battle finally ended, neither side had won. The mountain had been transformed into something else entirely, a massive crater filled with energies that shouldn't exist. Anyone who looked directly at it would experience temporal displacement, seeing their own past and future simultaneously until their mind couldn't process it anymore. The few survivors from both armies fled, broken and insane, babbling about things that human language couldn't express. That battle marked the beginning of what survivors called the unraveling. Both the Unity and the Enclave had exhausted their reserves, pushed their technologies beyond breaking points, sacrificed their best and brightest for a prize that might not have even existed. The careful structures both had built began to collapse. Unity forces without the Master's direct control reverted to base instincts, becoming roving bands of cannibalistic mutants. Enclave installations lost power one by one as their infrastructure failed without maintenance. I encountered a group of Enclave soldiers in late 2181 who had been cut off from their command structure. Without orders, without purpose, they had continued their last mission, which was to patrol a section of highway that no longer existed. They had been walking the same 10-mile stretch for months, executing anyone they encountered for trespassing on government property. Their power armor was failing, servos grinding with every step, but they couldn't stop. The conditioning went too deep. They would patrol until they died. Similarly, I found Unity converts who had been severed from the Master's psychic network. They retained their intelligence but had lost all sense of identity. They would approach humans and ask, "Who am I? What was my name?" When no one could answer, they would become violent, as if beating the information out of someone would restore their lost selves. One grabbed me, a super mutant who might have been female once, and begged me to tell her if she had ever been loved. I couldn't answer. How could I? She crushed my ribs before another survivor shot her in the head. The collapse of both powers didn't bring peace. It brought chaos of a different kind. Every petty warlord with ambitions saw opportunity in the power vacuum. But now they had access to weapons and technology that neither the Unity nor the Enclave had managed to secure before their fall. A raider gang found a warehouse full of Enclave chemical weapons. A slaver consortium discovered Unity psychic amplifiers. A tribal confederation stumbled upon a pre-war biological warfare laboratory that both major powers had somehow missed. The year 2182 saw the rise of what I call the inheritor warlords, those who claim succession from either the Unity or the Enclave. They wore the symbols, used the rhetoric, but understood nothing of the ideologies they claimed to represent. One called himself the New Master and tried to create his own FEV mutants using bathroom chemistry and radiation. The results were abominations that died in agony within hours, but not before spreading multiple plagues he had accidentally created. Another declared herself president of the true Enclave and began genetic purity tests that consisted of measuring skull shapes and eye colors based on pre-war fashion magazines she had found. Those who failed were burned alive as genetic deviants. The fact that she herself was obviously mutated, with scales covering half her body from radiation exposure, seemed lost on her followers, who were mostly raiders looking for an excuse to kill and pillage with ideological justification. The environment had become actively hostile to human life. I traveled through regions where the grass would try to burrow into your skin, where rain would burn through metal, where the very air would crystallize in your lungs if you breathed too deeply. These weren't intentional weapons anymore, just the result of so many different technologies and biological agents interacting in ways no one had predicted or could control. Food became increasingly impossible to find. Plants were either toxic or carnivorous. Animals were mutated beyond recognition, their meat poison even when cooked. Water sources were contaminated with FEV, radiation, chemical weapons, biological agents, and things that didn't have names. I survived on pre-war rations when I could find them, each can a little lottery of botulism or sustenance. Many weren't as lucky. Cannibalism became so common, it wasn't even hidden anymore. I need to tell you about the children born during these years because they represent the final death of hope. Those who survived birth were usually mutated in ways that made their parents abandon them. I found nurseries in abandoned vaults, where babies had been left to die because they had too many eyes, or not enough limbs, or skin that was transparent showing all their organs. The few who were raised grew up in a world where violence wasn't just common, but mandatory for survival. They didn't play, they practiced killing techniques. They didn't have dreams, they had strategies. In 2183, I met a group of teenagers who had formed their own tribe. They had no memory of the world before the Unity Enclave War, no concept that things had ever been different. They had developed their own language, a mixture of military terminology from both sides, and words for concepts that didn't exist before. They had a word, vrashek, that meant to kill someone you love to prevent them from suffering worse. They used it casually, discussing who had vrasheked whom like discussing the weather. These children had also developed their own technology, cobbled together from battlefield salvage. They created weapons that were crude but effective, armor made from super mutant skin and enclave plating, drugs distilled from irradiated plants that would let them fight through mortal wounds. They had no interest in rebuilding civilization because they had no concept of what civilization meant. When I tried to explain cities and governments and laws, they asked why anyone would make themselves so vulnerable. The knowledge of the old world wasn't just being lost, it was being actively destroyed. I watched a group burn a library for warmth. Thousands of books turned to ash because they were easier to burn than trying to find wood. Technical manuals were used as toilet paper. Historical documents were torn up for kindling. Even when people found valuable information, they often couldn't read it. Literacy was becoming rare. Why learn to read when every moment spent on education was a moment not spent on survival? Religious movements sprouted and died like mushrooms after rain. The Church of the Atom had mutated into dozens of schisms, each preaching their own version of nuclear salvation. The followers of the Master believed the Unity's creator would return in a new form. The Enclave purists insisted that genetic purity could still be achieved through ritual purification that usually involved lethal amounts of radiation. New cults emerged weekly, each offering their own explanation for the apocalypse and their own path to salvation, all of them violent. I spent time with one cult that worshipped the anomalies, believing them to be doorways to better worlds. They would conduct ceremonies where volunteers would walk into reality breaks, hoping to be transported to paradise. None ever returned, but the cult interpreted this as success. They grew increasingly aggressive in their recruitment, eventually forcing people into anomalies at gunpoint, convinced they were saving souls. I escaped when they decided my negative energy was preventing the doorways from opening properly. The concept of medicine had devolved into superstition and agony. Healers were usually just people who had survived enough injuries to know what might not kill you immediately. Surgery was performed with scavenged tools and no anesthesia except alcohol or worse. I watched a man have his leg amputated with a plasma cutter while biting down on a piece of super mutant leather. He survived the surgery but died from infection 3 days later because the only antibiotics available were pre-war drugs that had long since expired and become toxic. Mental health was never even considered. Post-traumatic stress was universal. Everyone had nightmares. Everyone had seen family die horribly. Everyone had done things they couldn't live with, but had to in order to survive. Suicide rates would have been astronomical if anyone had bothered to count. People would just walk into radiation zones, or pick fights they couldn't win, or simply stop eating. It was called going quiet, and was considered a reasonable life choice. By 2184, I had begun to notice patterns in the chaos, signs that something even worse was coming. The anomalies were growing, merging with each other, creating larger zones where reality simply didn't function properly. The various FEV strains in the environment were combining in ways that created new forms of mutation spontaneously. Ghouls were developing psychic abilities. Super mutants were growing additional organs with unknown functions. Humans exposed to certain combinations of radiation and chemicals were transforming into things that shouldn't be able to exist. Encountered a woman who had been exposed to a unique combination of Unity psychic energy and Enclave chemical weapons. She existed in multiple timelines simultaneously, able to see and interact with versions of reality where different choices had been made. She told me about a world where the Brotherhood of Steel had formed and prevented all of this. She described their citadel, their preservation of knowledge, their role in rebuilding civilization. Then she screamed as that timeline collapsed and she was pulled back into our nightmare. She begged me to kill her before disappearing entirely, shifting to another timeline I couldn't perceive. The wildlife had evolved beyond recognition. Deathclaws had developed camouflage abilities that made them nearly invisible. Cazadores had somehow acquired the ability to lay eggs in living hosts that would hatch and consume the host from inside while keeping them alive and conscious. Mirelurks had grown to massive sizes and developed a hive intelligence that allowed them to coordinate attacks across hundreds of miles. Even radroaches had become dangerous, some variants developing acidic secretions that could eat through power armor. Trade had completely collapsed. There was no currency that everyone accepted, no safe routes between settlements, no trust between traders. Bartering was done at gunpoint, each party ready to kill the other if they felt cheated. I watched a man trade his daughter for 3 cans of pre-war food, then shoot the buyer and take his daughter back along with the food. This was considered a successful business transaction. The only law was strength, and strength was measured in how much suffering you could inflict. Leaders weren't chosen for wisdom or competence, but for cruelty and ruthlessness. I saw a settlement where the mayor was a child, maybe 14, who had killed the previous mayor with her bare hands. She ruled through terror, having anyone who questioned her fed to the pack of feral ghouls she kept as pets. When I left, she was planning to attack a neighboring settlement not for resources, but because she was bored. Language itself was breaking down. Without schools, without books, without any standardization, dialects were emerging that were mutually incomprehensible. Technical terms were forgotten or changed meaning. Scientific concepts became mythology. I met groups that had been separated by less than 50 miles, who could no longer understand each other's speech. Communication failures led to violence more often than not, each group assuming the other was speaking in code or casting curses. By late 2184, I had started to document everything I could, knowing that someone needed to record how we had fallen so far. But even that was nearly impossible. Paper was rare and valuable for fire. Ink was non-existent. I carved notes on walls, on metal sheets, on anything that would last. Most of it was destroyed by weather, by animals, by people who didn't want reminders of what they'd lost. The last scientific expedition I knew of was organized by a group calling themselves the Seekers of Truth. They believed that somewhere in the ruins was the key to reversing everything. Some pre-war miracle technology that could fix the FEV, neutralize radiation, close the anomalies. They gathered the few remaining people with scientific knowledge and set out for a rumored intact laboratory in Montana. I heard later that they had found the lab, but it was guarded by security systems that killed most of them. The survivors discovered that the miracle technology was just theoretical research that had never been tested. They burned the lab down in their despair. If this story has kept you listening this far, and you want more of these dark confessions from the wasteland, hit that subscribe button. It tells me someone out there is still paying attention to warnings like these. The year 2185 brought the final revelation that broke whatever remained of my spirit. I discovered a bunker, sealed since the war, containing a complete archive of Roger Maxson's personal writings that he had started just days before his death. These weren't military reports or technical documents. They were his private thoughts about what he intended to build, what the Brotherhood of Steel was meant to become. Reading them was like looking at the blueprint for a heart, while standing in an ocean of blood. Maxson had envisioned the Brotherhood as more than just technology hoarders. He saw them as teachers eventually. Once humanity had proven itself ready, the Brotherhood would have shared its knowledge freely, would have rebuilt the universities and libraries, would have ensured that technology served humanity rather than destroying it. He wrote about mandatory ethical education for every Brotherhood member, about the responsibility that came with power, about the sacred duty to preserve human dignity even in warfare. Every word was a dagger reminding me of what we had lost. But the cruelest discovery was his final entry, written hours before the evacuation that would kill him. He had outlined a complete organizational structure, a ranking system, even philosophical principles that would guide the Brotherhood for centuries. He had planned for succession, for expansion, for the eventual integration with recovering human settlements. If he had lived just long enough to formally establish these structures, to pass them on to his lieutenants, everything would have been different. Instead, those ideas died with him in the radioactive dust. I need to tell you about the last days of the Unity, because they represent the ultimate corruption of what should have been prevented. By 2185, the Master had evolved beyond any physical form, existing as a distributed consciousness across thousands of converted beings. But without organized opposition to keep him focused, he had gone completely insane. The various parts of his consciousness had developed different personalities, different goals, and they were at war with each other. I witnessed a battle between two Unity factions, both claiming to serve the true Master. One believed in forced evolution through FEV, the other through cybernetic enhancement. They tore each other apart with weapons and abilities that should have been used to rebuild the world. Super mutants with mechanical limbs fought bio-enhanced abominations, while both screamed the same devotional prayers to a master who no longer existed as a coherent entity. The ground where they fought is still toxic, will be for centuries, saturated with so many different contaminants that no life can exist there. The Enclave's final days were no better. Without central command, individual bases had declared themselves the legitimate government and were actively fighting each other. I watched two Enclave battalions, both claiming to represent the true America, deploy chemical weapons against each other over a disagreement about the proper interpretation of pre-war constitutional law. They gassed each other with their own genetic purity weapons, dying by the thousands for principles they no longer understood. The environmental collapse accelerated beyond any possibility of recovery. The water cycle had been completely corrupted. Rain carried FEV, snow was radioactive, rivers ran with chemicals that dissolved organic matter on contact. The few remaining clean water sources were guarded by those strong enough to hold them, and they would rather destroy them than let them fall into enemy hands. I watched a warlord poison his own well with enough radiation to kill a city, rather than let attackers capture it. He died of thirst 3 days later, satisfied that he had denied his enemies victory. Food production had become impossible. The soil was dead, poisoned by decades of chemical and biological weapons. Nothing would grow except mutated fungi that were more likely to eat you than be eaten. The few remaining Brahmin were dying of diseases no one could identify or treat. Even radroaches were becoming scarce, unable to adapt to the increasingly hostile environment. Cannibalism wasn't just common, it was becoming the only reliable food source. I met the last farmer in North America in late 2185. He had managed to keep a small greenhouse running using pre-war technology, growing actual vegetables in carefully controlled conditions. He had defended it for 40 years against raiders, mutants, and worse. When I found him, he was dying. Radiation sickness finally catching up after decades of exposure. He showed me his greenhouse, his life's work, 20 square meters of actual food plants. As we watched, the glass cracked from another distant explosion and contaminated air rushed in. The plants withered and died in minutes. He took his own life rather than watch them rot. The children born in these final years weren't human in any sense we would recognize. Constant exposure to environmental mutagens meant that baseline humans were extinct. Everyone was mutated to some degree. I saw babies born with translucent skin, their organs visible and glowing. Children with extra limbs that moved independently, as if controlled by different minds. Teenagers who aged at different rates in different parts of their bodies, with child faces on elderly bodies or ancient eyes in infant skulls. These new generations had no concept of the past. To them, the world had always been hell. They developed philosophies that would have horrified any pre-war thinker. They believed suffering was the natural state, that peace was a myth invented by the weak, that the only purpose of life was to inflict more damage than you received. They weren't evil, not in any traditional sense. They simply had no framework for understanding good. In 2186, I encountered what might have been the last library in existence. It was guarded by a group of ghouls who had maintained it since the bombs fell. They couldn't read anymore, their minds too degraded by centuries of radiation. But they remembered that the books were important. They had developed elaborate rituals around the library's protection, treating the books as holy relics without understanding their actual purpose. I spent 3 months there, reading everything I could, trying to preserve some fraction of human knowledge. I found technical manuals that explained how to build water purifiers, medical textbooks that could have prevented countless deaths, agricultural guides that could have restored food production. But there was no one left capable of understanding them, no infrastructure to implement them, no society stable enough to benefit from them. The Brotherhood would have preserved this knowledge and slowly reintroduced it. Instead, it molded in a tomb, guarded by creatures who had forgotten how to read. The last battle between organized forces occurred in spring of 2186. The remnants of the Unity and the Enclave, neither more than a few hundred strong, met at what had been the Grand Canyon. The battle lasted 17 minutes. Both sides deployed weapons they didn't fully understand, devices salvaged from arsenals they could no longer maintain. The resulting explosion could be seen from 500 miles away. When the light faded, the Grand Canyon was gone, replaced by a smooth bowl of glass 20 miles across. Nothing survived, not even bacteria. After that, there were no more armies, no more factions, just scattered groups of survivors picking through the bones of the world. The population of North America, which might have recovered into the millions with proper guidance, had fallen below 10,000. Most of those were so mutated, so psychologically damaged, that calling them human was more habit than accuracy. I found a vault in late 2186, Vault 119, that had never opened. Its experiment had been to remain sealed for exactly 110 years, opening in 2187. The door mechanisms were still functional, the reactor still running, everything perfect for the scheduled opening. I managed to access their external communication system and tried to warn them, tried to tell them to stay sealed, that the world outside was worse than any vault experiment could be. They thought I was part of their test, a Vault Tech psychological evaluation. They said they looked forward to helping rebuild America. I was there when Vault 119 opened on January 1st, 2187. 200 people emerged, healthy, educated, organized, and full of hope. They had preserved pre-war knowledge, had plans for reconstruction, had even maintained a seed vault for restarting agriculture. They lasted 36 hours. The first raider attack came at nightfall. The vault dwellers, trained in pre-war civil defense that assumed cooperative rebuilding, were slaughtered. The raiders didn't even take anything useful, just killed for entertainment and left the bodies to rot. The seed vault's contents were scattered to the wind by raiders who thought they might be drugs. Centuries of carefully preserved genetic material, the key to restoring agriculture, was lost in minutes. I tried to gather what I could, but the seeds were already contaminated by the toxic environment. When I tried to plant some in a controlled environment I had constructed, They grew into things that bore no resemblance to food plants. One produced fruit that exploded when ripe. Another grew roots that sought out and strangled any other plant nearby. By 2187, I had become something I didn't recognize. I had survived by doing things that would have horrified the person I used to be. I had killed for food, for water, for shelter. I had left wounded allies behind because helping them would slow me down. I had watched children die and done nothing because saving them would have attracted attention. I wasn't human anymore, just another predator in a world of predators. The last scientific mind I met was a woman who had been a Brotherhood scribe in the timeline she claimed to half remember through recurring dreams. She insisted that in another reality, she had helped develop a cure for FEV, had worked with elder lions to distribute clean water to the Capital Wasteland, had seen humanity begin to recover. In our world, she was dying of 12 different cancers, using her last days to try to build a water purifier from scrap metal and half-remembered training. It didn't work. Nothing worked anymore. The anomalies had grown to cover entire states. There were regions where entering meant never leaving, where the laws of physics were suggestions at best. I skirted the edge of one such zone and saw impossible things. Water flowing upward, fires that froze things, creatures that existed in states between life and death. At the center of the largest anomaly, something was growing, something vast and wrong that hurt to perceive even from miles away. Some survivors had started worshipping it as a god. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was what we deserved. Language had degraded to the point where complex ideas couldn't be expressed anymore. The concepts needed to rebuild civilization, words like democracy, justice, cooperation, had no meaning to anyone still alive. The new languages that emerged were focused entirely on survival, violence, and suffering. They had 17 words for different types of pain, but none for love. They could describe 100 ways to kill, but had no word for healing. I discovered the last functioning computer terminal in 2188, in a bunker that had somehow maintained power through a geothermal tap. It contained the complete archives of human history, every war, every peace, every achievement and failure of our species. I sat there for days, reading about the world that was lost, about the potential we had squandered. The terminal's last entry was a projection created by a pre-war AI, showing what the world could have become if certain key events had occurred, if certain organizations had formed to guide humanity through the darkness. The Brotherhood of Steel featured prominently in every successful projection, not as conquerors or dictators, but as guardians and teachers, slowly helping humanity reclaim its birthright. In every timeline where they existed, civilization recovered within 2 centuries. In their absence, the projections showed exactly what I had witnessed: collapse, devolution, extinction. We were living in the worst-case scenario, the timeline that pre-war scientists had considered so unlikely they barely modeled it. As I record this in 2189, I am the last person I know of who remembers the name Roger Maxson, who understands what the Brotherhood of Steel was supposed to be. The new generations don't even have words for the concepts the Brotherhood would have preserved. They live in a world where technology is magic, where the past is myth, where the future is unimaginable, because it will be exactly like the present, brutal and short. I've hidden caches of information throughout the wasteland, hoping that someday, somehow, someone will find them and understand. But I know it's futile. Without the framework the Brotherhood would have provided, without the preservation of knowledge and controlled reintroduction of technology, these caches are just more debris in a dead world. The few who might find them can't read. Those who can read won't understand. Those who understand won't survive long enough to use the knowledge. The world is dying, and we killed it. Not with the bombs. Those just started the process. We killed it with every weapon we deployed instead of secured. Every technology we weaponized instead of studied. Every choice we made for power instead of preservation. The Brotherhood of Steel would have been our conscience, our memory, our hope for redemption. Without them, we became monsters, and monsters don't build civilizations. They only destroy them. There's a terrible irony in my survival this long. I've outlived nations, armies, ideologies, and perhaps humanity itself. I've seen the complete collapse of everything our species built over millennia, and through it all, I've carried the knowledge of how easily it could have been prevented. One man, surviving one day longer, establishing one organization, could have changed everything. Captain Roger Maxson and his Brotherhood of Steel weren't just a military order that never formed. They were humanity's last chance, and we lost it to a piece of shrapnel on the first day of the apocalypse. I don't know who might find this recording. Maybe no one. Maybe the world will finally finish dying before anyone does. But if you're listening to this, if somehow, somewhere, humanity gets another chance, remember this. Technology is not your enemy. Ignorance is. Power is not evil, its misuse is. The Brotherhood of Steel understood this. They would have been harsh teachers, but necessary ones. They would have held back progress until we proved we deserved it. They would have been hated and feared and absolutely essential. Without them, we got freedom, the freedom to destroy ourselves absolutely. We got equality, the equality of extinction. We got the wasteland we deserved because we proved we couldn't be trusted with anything better. My name is Sergeant Marcus Cole. I was there when Captain Maxson died. I've spent 60 years watching the world pay for that loss. This is my testimony. This is my warning. This is my confession. The Brotherhood of Steel never existed, and that's why humanity never survived.